Welcome to Wordsmiths and Wolfhound, happiness through art and self-sufficiency. Today, we're going to be, besides dealing with Lead in here, our wonderful Wolfhound, and she's just buried herself in my lap. We're going to be talking definitely about happiness and arts. We're going to be talking about the Chronicles of Narnia and C.S. Lewis. And I, of course, have to start with the joke. So Arthur C. Clarke, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien walk into a bar, arguing about how characters should travel. Arthur C. Clarke, of course, says they should be on a spaceship. J.R.R. Tolkien says they should just take a walk. And Lewis, of course, says just step through a wardrobe. And both of them asked, how is that even possible? And Lewis said, it's Narnia business.
I was waiting for that punchline. I could not see what was coming.
There we go.
So what do we have to drink tonight?
Well, we have some port wine. It is a tawny port, which you can only call yourself a port wine if you're from Portugal. And so these companies are set there, and it is wonderful. But the reason I selected this was because we're talking about C.S. Lewis and a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien. This is all set in Britain, Oxford, Cambridge. What would you have over a cigar and next to a wonderful fireplace but a glass of claret? And so between claret, which is a Burgundy type wine, and port, you have the essence of what it means to sit in front of a fireplace with a wonderful person next to you talking about wonderful subjects. And here we are.
And Narnia is a fantastic subject. That is delicious. That is often referred to as a dessert wine, is it not?
Yes. And it's got a wonderful, rich flavor, one that you would not necessarily want to be chugging. And so we just have small glasses of it, which is nice. Right. So regarding Narnia and C.S. Lewis, Laura, tell us who C.S. Lewis is.
Well, as we discussed in our last review video, C.S. Lewis was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He was a professor of medieval history at, I believe, both Cambridge and Oxford. And don't ask me which was first, I can't remember. He was an absolute prolific writer of both fiction and nonfiction. He is famous for having set out when he was, I believe, in his late 20s, early 30s, to be the one man in history who could finally definitively disprove Christianity. And instead, the more he researched, he was, as he said, dragged kicking and screaming into believing in Christianity. And so a lot of his writings revolved around that. But as I said, he also wrote fiction. So he was famous, for example, well, obviously for Narnia, which we're talking about today. It's been made into, I think, at least 3 variations of movies or television series, one of which I like much better than one of the others. He's famous for The Great Divorce. He's famous for the Screwtape Letters, which we talked about last time on the anniversary of his death. Surprised by Joy was written after his wife, Joy, died after a very short marriage of, I believe it was only about 3.5 years at most. God in the Dock is one of his theological works, a collection of very lengthy essays. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. So, and those are just a few. There are, as I said, he was prolific. We can spend a good part of this video just listing all his books.
Excellent. So we often hear about C.S. Lewis in the context of J.R.R. Tolkien. So maybe tell me a bit about that and maybe the ink spots as well and subjects such as that.
Right. The ink spots were a group of writers who met at, do you remember the name? I think it was called ink spots.
That I don't remember.
Okay, so I could be wrong, or it might have been called The Child and the Eagle. I should have looked this up.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was called The Child and the Eagle, but as a writers group, they called themselves the Ink Spots, and famously, it included both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And so one of the chief debates between them, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, being the author of
The Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. All you needed to say was Legolas. I remembered.
I'm trying to have the length of my beard,
Right.
just-
Well, right, the hair. My kids did once get me like twice life-size poster of Legolas. And I put that up on the wall going to the basement and then had to explain to workmen when they came in, well, you see, I'm in love with Legolas. There's that long, beautiful hair. But one of the disagreements or, points of discussion maybe that they had was just how clear and obvious an analogy or an allegory should be. And so I think anybody who's read both Lord of the Rings and Narnia will see that Narnia doesn't hit you over the head with the allegory quite the way Pilgrim's Progress does. That like hits you over the head and kicks you in the gut, saying, I am an allegory. This is what I mean. This is what each person stands for. C.S. Lewis is not that obvious. And yet he's more obvious than Tolkien was. Tolkien believed that the allegory had to be much, much more subdued, would you say? Covered up. And I think Tolkien also wrote, or did he do a translation of a book called The Anchorn
With, and it was
of course,
a book.
you're using the English pronunciation.
Yes, indeed. And this was a book about practices of an order of anchorites. These were primarily nuns, but some men who would literally wall themselves up in a cell, only really have two portals from that cell. One was to the outside, where people could come and petition them with, and ask for prayer on their behalf. And one was inward to the church, where they could see Mass being said and given, essentially. And, they had basically what amounted to very little food and water, a very sparse living area, and essentially a bucket. And that was about all that they had in that. J.R.R. Tolkien actually translated from Old English to Middle English a version of this rule, because most of this dates from about the 12th century. The practice of anchorites was actually fairly well gone from the late 12th century on.
Right, and I think we have a copy of that book.
We do. We have J.R.R. Tolkien's book, and then we've also got the modern English translation.
Right. I should have thought to bring that. It's an interesting look at a very different way of life, a very different philosophy of living that focuses very much on God, whereas we focus very much on this world. And if anyone out there is interested in reading more about anchoresses or anchorites, Julian of Norwich is a very fascinating character. And I shouldn't say character, she was a historical figure. She lived, but she spent most of her life in one of these cells. And she wasn't, in a sense, cut off from the outside world, because she did have that grill where people could come from the outside and they would come to her and seek counsel. So she definitely had a lot of contact with the outside world. At the same time, she was always physically walled off from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about an overview of Narnia?
So, amazingly, despite being 7 books long, Narnia is really a very quick and easy read in a lot of ways, and that's because it's wonderfully engaging. So some sets do not list this first. The Magician's Nephew comes, I don't know, more like 4th or 5th in the series. However, chronologically, in this set it comes first, chronologically in the story it comes first. And it tells the story of how humans, people from Earth, first stumbled onto Narnia. So that is a fascinating story. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is probably what people know the best. And in many renditions of the box set, this is actually the first book of the series. And it tells of the 4 siblings, Lucy, Susan, Edmund, and Peter. And how Lucy finds her way into Narnia by way of the wardrobe, and the encounters with the White Witch and the endless winter, and how Aslan comes along and finally brings spring.
And my favorite part, Turkish Delight.
That was not Edmund's favorite part. So The Horse and His Boy is what we might call a bit of a spin-off. It's telling the story of a boy who lives in this whole Narnian world, and how he ends up with this princess, and they're running across the desert. They're being chased by a lion. their adventures and lessons they learn. And again, I kind of hate to say lessons they learn because that scares people off. But I think most good stories do kind of have some morals like that. Prince Caspian, I believe we are back to, is it Lucy and Edmund maybe?
That I just don't
I
remember.
believe it's Lucy and Edmund, but they also bring in, if I'm keeping all my stories straight, a couple of their cousins. I could be wrong, maybe it's the four siblings again. But Prince Caspian is the story of a young prince named Caspian, hence the name of the book, who has grown up being told stories by his tutor of old Narnia where animals could talk. And the Narnia of this book, we open with something very much like our own world, where they only believe in science, they don't believe in talking animals, they don't believe in any of this. And Prince Caspian starts to discover that maybe some of these old stories and old traditions and beliefs might actually be true, and that maybe his evil uncle is evil. His evil uncle didn't tell him that. Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we are back to Prince Caspian and his exploits. And I know at this point, one of the Pevensies' cousins shows up, and I believe that's the one that has Eustace in it. Their horrible, awful cousin who becomes better during that. The Silver Chair, I believe, has Eustace again, and he brings in one of his classmates, and they get into Narnia. And they have a whole series of adventures with Puddleglum, who complains about everything. You know anyone like that? I'm sure everybody in the world knows someone like that. Although Puddleglum is actually quite likable, unlike most people who complain endlessly. And they meet some very interesting characters. And finally, we have the last battle. Now, at some point in the series, the Pevensey children, which is Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter, are told that they can only come back to Narnia so many times. And so strangely, they end up in Narnia again. And they don't understand why, because they were told they can't come back again. So the last battle ends up being, as the name suggests, the last great clash between good and evil.
I like the name Puddleglum. There seems to be a C.S. Lewis book of names where Puddleglum comes in, and we've also got Slubgod from reviewing the Screwtape Letters last time.
Well, if that book hasn't been written, I should write it.
Yes, indeed.
1001 Narnia names for your new baby.
Yes, exactly. What is the appeal of the Narnian Chronicles?
I can only speak for myself, but I think the appeal of fiction in general is going to be, is it an enjoyable read? And I think for many people, an additional appeal of fiction is, does it engage your mind? You know, you can read a book. I don't want to slander any particular genre, but there are books and genres which, you know, really don't require much of you. They're just like fluff reading. And sometimes you want that. And here might be the place, I admit, to reading the entire Sweet Valley High series. I
have to move my chair a little farther.
I know. I have to try and move away from myself. And that was at a time of horrible stress when I was still back in Washington State with 5 of my kids, while the rest of the kids and my husband were in Minneapolis, and I was still trying to teach and take care of 5 kids and get the house ready for moving. And that's the time when you just go, light, mindless fluff is a good thing.
Potato chip books, I call them.
Right. So I confess that I did read that entire series, and you know, these poor twins got kidnapped like 16 times in their junior year, and at least 84 people they knew had cancer, and I think their homecoming dance got blown up 2 or 3 times. And eventually I started to go, I don't think this is real. But I think that, you know, there's definitely some people, and sometimes we really want books that engage our mind, that draw us in a little bit deeper. And that's the wonder and magic of C.S. Lewis's Narnia, is that it's just a light, enjoyable read. You can read it and not think about anything, but all of a sudden then your mind starts going, wait a second, I think there's more here. And, you know, especially for kids maybe, who some of these ideas are newer to, who the concept of an allegory is newer to. But I think even for older people, you know, there's something to be gotten out of starting to see some of these themes that he's developing.
Yes, indeed. So how does the appeal of Narnia actually fit into the deeper purpose of reading itself?
Well, and again, this goes to what is anyone's purpose in reading at a certain time, or the deeper question, what should the purpose of reading be? To me, the purpose of reading is really to expand the mind and gain wisdom. And I think these books do that in a very enjoyable way. And I think fiction in particular, it reaches us on a level that nonfiction doesn't. And I think that's because we're not setting out to agree or disagree. We're just reading. We're thinking about these people. We're drawn into who they are, the situation, their emotions. And I think that's especially important in this day and age when we're very, very divided. And I think today so many people tend to come at any idea from, is that an idea from the side I agree with or the side I disagree with? And they start from that premise, who's saying it, and then they decide, do I agree or disagree? Whereas we should be looking at an idea and saying, what is the idea? What is the worth of the idea? Do I agree or disagree with the idea and the thoughts themselves? And I think when we read a story, it pulls us in that way, that we're thinking about ideas. We're not trying to peg-hole it into, is this the side I agree with or not? And, again, it can be enjoyed just as a story. It's both creative and it's intellectual.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know from, as we were talking a little earlier about J.R.R. Tolkien, the idea of both Lord of the Rings and Narnia being allegories. And of course, perhaps tell us what an allegory is, and then tell us what allegories are actually in them.
Well, that's a big question. An allegory is a story in which everything represents a different idea. And so, for example, the classic theme is Pilgrim's Progress by, I should know this. Pilgrim's Progress, I know this.
And I do as well. But yes, we both forgot. So we'll have to look that up.
Bunyan.
There we go.
Right, Bunyan. So Pilgrim's Progress is the classic. And so it starts off with a man named Christian. And you would never guess what the man named Christian stands for. Can you guess?
Christian?
Right, he stands for Christian. And so that's what I meant before when I said it's painfully obvious, like slaps you over the head and in the face, obvious, leaves you with two black eyes, obvious, And so he's called away by someone named, I don't know, it's been a long time since I read it. I have read it, and as he travels along his road, the characters he meets, they're people, but they're all named things like, I don't know, virtue or patience or despair and it's painfully obvious. But we're supposed to learn from following his journey, these ideas about virtue, about vice, about persistence, from watching Christian's journey that is painfully obvious, and other allegories much less so. So in Narnia, I have a list here, since I'm not going to remember them all off the top of my head. Some of the obvious allegories are there's the fight between good and evil.
Yes,
that's a really obvious one, and I think that's classic in much fiction, if not all. In Narnia, there is the idea that there is a world beyond what we see. So the whole series is set in the time of World War II. The children have been sent out from London to live with their eccentric great uncle. And there is a discussion between Peter and the uncle when Lucy first says, I went through the wardrobe into another world. And Peter goes to his uncle and says, we're very concerned about her. And his uncle says something to the effect of, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And so that, of course, is very pronounced that some people can get to this world and some people never do see it. God is Aslan, there is an allegory. If you go through the book, you see where Aslan sacrifices himself, goes to the White Witch and says, you can take me in place of Edmund, who has become a slave to the White Witch. That's a clear allegory to Christ dying on the cross as Aslan is shorn and killed on this great altar. And all the forces of evil dance around. And it's very vivid, and it makes us maybe see the crucifixion in a way we might not have before. And yet, if you don't want to see that allegory there, it's not going to be there. It's just going to be a story of this lion who had this great power. So that to me is one of the things that's appealing about it. Anybody can enjoy this. Aslan sings the world into being, just as we read that God spoke the world into being. Those who want to see Aslan can see him. Those who don't want to can't. For those whose hearts aren't ready, can't. So for instance, early on, Lucy is the only one. She's the youngest of 4 siblings, and she's the only one who ever sees Aslan. And bit by bit, her older siblings have to decide whether they trust her or not. And the more they trust her, the more they follow her, their hearts and their minds begin to change, and now they're able to see Aslan too. And I do think that speaks to, the reality that some people, for whatever reason, just cannot see a world beyond this one. The voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace needs cleansing from all these horrible things he's done. And I mean, he's a kid, he hasn't done anything that terrible, but he has been, I believe, as they say it in England in the 1940s, the bit of a prig. And yes, to not being a prig, don't be a prig.
Don't be that guy.
Right. So, he has just been a pretty miserable person. He's the kind who looks for ways to tattle on all his classmates. He looks for ways to get people in trouble. Poor kid, he's pretty awful, And he has to be cleansed from that. He has to heal from that. So he goes through this experience with Aslan. Actually, it's a dragon in this case, where the dragon scratches him and peels off layer after layer, and it's painful. And yet he ends up being very happy that he has been freed from this layer upon layer of the ugliness in his own heart and his own mind. The last battle. We see a group of, it's a wonderful scene. It's been years since I've read it, but it is so vivid, where these two factions are fighting, and then the trolls, I think it's the trolls, have decided, we're not for Kellermead and we're not for Narnia. We hate all of you. We don't trust any of you anymore. And you can understand why if you've read the book. But the end result is when the bad guys are throwing everyone into this hut that in theory they're going to set on fire and burn, and everybody's terrified to be thrown into this hut because they think they're going to die. Well, when the people who are blinded to Aslan are thrown into the hut, all they can see is this dark, dank interior, and they see 4 walls around them, and they're all huddled in fear. Whereas the people on Aslan's side are thrown in, and they're shocked to be thrown through this dark door, and yet suddenly there's this whole wide world beyond them, and there's sun shining, and there are hills, and there are flowers, and there are trees. And the allegory, of course, is, I think you could see multiple allegories out of this, but I'll just say as one example, when you come to life with a certain perspective, everything looks very different. And where one person might be in the exact same situation and say, this is awful, it's terrible, I'm miserable, I'm unhappy, another person in the same situation might be seeing all the good. So I'll tell you one story. This is a fascinating story. You know who Corrie ten Boom is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for those who don't, she and her family hid Jews during World War II, and they were from Holland. And her father ran a clock shop, and they built a secret room, and they hid Jews, and they drilled to be able to hide them at the drop of a pin if the Nazis came in the middle of the night. And eventually they got caught, and she and her sister ended up in a concentration camp. And sometimes they weren't popular with the other women in the shack they lived in, because they were determined to follow the Bible and thank God for everything. And so when the women were all full of lice, there were Corrie and her sister Betsy, thanking God for the lice. As you can imagine, that did not go over well.
I can't imagine.
And yet, what ended up happening was there came a day not too far after they were busy thanking God for the lice that, I don't know if a prisoner had escaped, something like that. The Nazi guards were very upset and angry, and they demanded that these women come out of this hut, and, they were going to do something awful to them, of course, if they did, whatever, kill a few of them, something like that. And these women refused to come out, and thanks to the lice, the guards refused to go in and get them. And so I thought, to me, that was always a powerful story. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can tie back to the scene in Narnia, that how you look at life is going to affect your attitude, how you approach life, how you handle life. So another interesting theme or idea that comes up is this idea, it ties into what I just talked about, that sometimes what we think is bad is really God leading us or teaching us. So for instance, in The Horse and His Boy, the lion is chasing the horses, and the lion claws Erebus, who is this princess that is riding with the boy, and I should have checked his name. It's been a while since I read it. But the lion claws the princess down her back, and she's really injured rather badly. And yet the horses do escape, get to where they need to be, and somebody's able to kind of heal her back and put balm on it and all of this. And we later learned that what the boy and Erebus feared, the lion, was really to their benefit, because the fear and being chased is what spurred them on to the exertion they needed that they didn't think they would have on their own. But fear and adrenaline gave them the ability to ride as fast as they needed to ride. And they really did. And then we find out, too, that the claws down Erebus's back was she had been an extremely haughty princess. And she had had one of her servants whipped for, I don't know, some minor stupid thing. And so it was also a little bit of, I hate to say karma, but a way of showing her, this is what you did to another person. And there's some sort of atonement, maybe. So then one or two final ones I'll mention. In the last battle, we see the ape convincing the donkey to dress as lion. And that's really an allegory, a message, a moral that we need to be careful what we believe, because this donkey dresses as a lion and convinces a lot of people that he's really Aslan.
False prophet.
Exactly. That's the perfect allegory for what we're warned about believing false prophets. You need to believe, you need to have faith, but you also need to be wise. You also need to weigh what you're hearing. You don't just blindly believe anything. Anytime anyone says, hey, God told me. So Aslan gives messages to some of them about how they're to proceed. For others, he's not so direct, but he's always leading the people in this book in one way or another. And I think that's another powerful message or an allegory to us, that some people, I think, are getting very, very clear, direct messages from God, and other people, it's much more subtle. It's the coincidences, the things that are dropped in your path, the words people say that spark an idea, things like that. And finally, I'll just say, to me, one of the allegories or themes in this book is that God has a purpose for each of us. If you go through these 7 books, there's a reason for each of them to be there. They each have something to offer that Aslan needs from them for the benefit of other people. And again, in a way, I hate to talk about these deep themes and allegories and morals, because it makes it sound like heavy reading, and it's not. It's just, there are these light, fun adventures. And that's what I love about them.
So what you're saying, perhaps, with all these allegories is that you never met a 4 you didn't like.
I've met some 5s I didn't like. Actually, I like number 5.
So what does it matter if God has a purpose for it?
I think it matters profoundly, because it's well known that people who have a sense of purpose in life are happier. And I think people who have a sense of purpose in life tend to live longer too. When we're purposeless, we wake up in the morning, we're not necessarily happy, we don't necessarily think that our lives matter. So purpose is everything.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much, Laura, for telling us so much about the Chronicles of Narnia here on Wordsmiths in a Wolfhound. I'd like to cover a little bit about what our next topics are going to be. We have a couple in mind. One is bread making. And, this gets to the age-old joke of a man being asked what his wife's favorite flour is. And of course, he turns to his wife and says self-rising. Well, we're not going to use self-rising flour. We're going to use regular flour and some yeast and actually make bread from scratch. And then the other topic that we have coming up is taking a look at an author by the name of Ayn Rand, who was born Alyssa Rosenbaum, actually in Russia. And the stories that she had to tell us through her fiction, we're going to start with Atlas Shrugged, but also, talking about how Atlas Shrugged is her exposition of her philosophical school called objectivism, and how that can be relevant, especially today when we're taking a look at a lot of different socialist and communist kind of rising, if you will, even in the United States at this time, and the lessons that Ayn Rand can teach us from the turn of the last century. So these are the types of things we're going to be taking a look at over the next couple of episodes, and we look forward to your return, especially over a glass of wonderful claret or port.
And I believe we'll also have some medieval music in medieval locations.
And there we go, which is very important to us.